species management and restoration. I'm Bill Jacobs with LISMA. Welcome to the case studies in invasive species and management, invasive species management and restoration session. This is session 1A. For those of you working on continuing education credits, as we did in the previous sessions, please sign in the Zoom chat. And you can do this at the start of each webinar session that you're entering credits or getting credits for. Enter your crediting organization, whether it's DEC or landscape architects or arborists, your full name, your email address, and your license or certificate number. So to sign in for credits, go to the chat, put your name and information there. At the end of the session, please go again to the chat to sign out. Just put your full name in the chat at the end of every session. I'll introduce our first speakers, and then I'll turn over the screen to you. Our first speakers for the session are Nancy Pau and Hannah Grinnell. Nancy has been a wildlife biologist at Parker National Wildlife Refuge on Plum Island for 19 years. Nancy holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Cornell University. Through combating invasive plants, climate change impacts, and educating the public, Nancy's job is to ensure that the refuge and surrounding lands continues to support wildlife for future generations. Nancy works with partners to develop innovative restoration techniques for the Great Marsh, which include figuring out how to make the refuge's coastal habitats more resilient to climate change and how to work collaboratively with local communities towards that common goal. Nancy is joined by Hannah Grinnell, a sophomore at Connecticut College, majoring in environmental studies, who has worked the past 2 summers as part of the Pepperweed strike team, helping to control and manage this invasive plant. Please welcome Nancy and Hannah. So I'll stop sharing. There you go. And Nancy, you're muted. If you're
okay, thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
Can you guys see the slides well?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bill, for the introduction. And we're excited to talk to you a little bit about our efforts with Pepperweed in the Great Marsh of Massachusetts. And I heard that Luke gave you guys a little bit update of Pepperweed in Long Island. And it's nice to reconnect because probably over 15 years ago, we connected with the town of Stony Brook when Pepperweed was found in Long Island, and compare kind of our efforts and try to coordinate a little bit. So because you guys already know a little bit about Pepperweed, I'm not going to go too much into the details. Is this better? But Pepperweed is invading a few of the coastal habitats. Mainly it's in salt marshes, and that's where we first found it on the refuge. More recently, we've also noticed that it can also invade dune habitat, into dunal swales, and also roadside habitat, and as well as some garden areas in different parts. As far as we know, Pepperweed is still somewhat sporadic on the East Coast. It has taken over the West Coast of the United States and is pretty pervasive. But on the East Coast, it is found mainly in north of Boston, a few areas south. Most of those counties in Massachusetts that's away from the coast, most of that Pepperweed is along highways. There is one location in the White Mountains along the roadway as well. And we've found additional areas in Maine, and one area in Rhode Island, again, along roadways. So the nice thing is wherever pepperweed has been found, local organizations have come to the table and have been trying to eradicate these small populations. So for the Great Marsh, just to provide a little bit of history, we first found pepperweed on the refuge itself in the early 1990s. This was before I came to the refuge, and the previous biologist had tried pulling it and using herbicide rodeo and did not have that much success. So when I got to the refuge, we experimented with some different types of herbicides and connected with folks out west that were doing more coordinated control. We found that pulling and herbicide, certain types of herbicides like Escor was successful. So we started treating it on the refuge and adjacent to the refuge. Pretty soon we realized that this pepperweed was not respecting any boundaries, and we needed a more coordinated effort. So we joined forces with Mass Audubon, who had a very extensive Saltmarsh school education program, as well as a lot of connections to local organizations. One of the groups that has been involved with pepperweed from the very beginning is a local high school leadership group, the Gulf of Maine Institute, or GOMI as we call them. And Hannah is a member of the GOMI, and she'll talk a little bit about how they have been involved. So since 2007, we've had 2 coordinators that support pepperweed control throughout the Great Marsh. So the Great Marsh is 20,000 acres. So we treat pepperweed throughout the 20,000 acres, as well as coordinate, help coordinate pepperweed control from Maine down to Boston. And I'll talk a little bit about our more recent shifts as the control of pepperweed have shifted. But the partnerships to date include 3 states, so Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. We coordinate pepperweed on 32 towns. We have over a dozen organizations supporting us in this project, and over 400 volunteers that's involved in our project. So over the years, obviously, we've had to increase the capacity as we found more and more pepperweed. So on the graph on the left, you can see that when we started in 2006, we were mostly pulling. So the blue is pull, the red is spray, the green is pulling and spraying. So we do a little bit of both. And the yellow is cleared. That means we have eradicated pepperweed from that area. And the white is areas we were not able to get to that year. So if you look at 2006, you can see that we started pretty small, and then we would just start mapping during the off season and find new sites of pepperweed. So we kind of started in the refuge and then kept expanding out until we pretty much went from Salem Sound all the way up through New Hampshire, and are controlling sites in that region. In 2015, we actually had to start mapping a little bit differently because the sites we were treating were getting so small that, where it was like an acre or a quarter of an acre, now there was only a few stands of pepperweed interspersed, so it was more difficult to see. So we actually broke our sites into smaller dots so that we can re-find them from year to year. But as you can see, it's continuing to expand. The graph on the right is our volunteer involvement, and it increased drastically in the beginning years. And then we kind of tailored it down in 2014 and 15, mainly because, again, as these large pepperweed sites were getting under control, we didn't need large groups of 10 or 20 people to help us pull anymore. So the number of volunteers dropped off. And we'll talk about how we're addressing those sites in a little bit. And then 2020 was, the pandemic year. So we really were only using volunteers that had previously been trained, and we weren't taking new volunteers. So as we had more success with pepperweed control, as I mentioned, we realized that we couldn't use these large volunteers anymore because the sites didn't need them. We also wanted to shift from pulling as much pepperweed as possible to making sure we had a dedicated crew that would focus on eradication, making sure that every pepperweed is pulled at those sites. So because we have been working with the Gulf of Maine youth for so many years, we turned to them and formed a new partnership and started hiring the Pepperweed Strike Team, which largely recruited from the GOMI youth, but it was also made available to other youth that was locally in the area. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah.
Hi, everyone. So like Nancy said, I've been doing pepperweed for the past 2 summers. And as this slide kind of showcases, we primarily map, pull, and monitor the sites. We get landowner permission, which is essentially something I did a couple summers ago, sending out new forms to make sure that everyone is aware that we're going to be pulling pepperweed on their property if they want that. Recruiting volunteers and also leading volunteer and group pulls with particularly local high school students and middle school students, presentations to local communities about pepperweed and the project and why we're doing this. And as I'll talk a little bit about later, new partnerships with GOMI and also climate cafes, which is more of a youth advocacy local environmental group that I'm also a part of. So from my experience, I really feel like the GOMI Pepperweed team is defined by the development, leadership, and advocacy that it fosters. I think that based on my experience and talking to other interns, this summer experience really offers a unique opportunity for young people to gain a better understanding of the local ecosystem in a way that isn't always accessible in a classroom setting, and to be able to be exposed to hands-on field work and conservation and restoration projects really helps us gain a better appreciation for the environment, and also helps to carry us into being future climate leaders, because we're all going to inherit that responsibility. It allows us to engage with the community in ways that I hope is inspiring to other people to see us being a part of such an important effort. Yeah, can we go to the next slide? So like I was kind of talking about before, climate cafes are an alternative way that we try to communicate the importance of this invasive plant work to the public. Rather than more hands-on science-based work, climate cafes are based in conversation and discussion with the community. I really feel like tackling issues of invasives needs to be more than just the science. We also need to be able to effectively communicate why these issues are so important, why we're doing this, why it matters. So many times out in the field when you're pulling pepperweed, people will come up to you and not know what you're doing, and they're genuinely curious. But I feel like that's a testament to why we need to have these conversations and to focus on communication in the local community about these efforts. And climate cafes in particular are providing spaces led by students, putting students and young people at the center of this initiative to communicate the importance of these kinds of issues. So earlier this year, I conducted some surveys with past interns, trying to gather some information on their experiences doing pepperweed, what they felt like they gained from it and learned from it. And these are just some quotes that I pulled from interns from the past 2 summers, talking about how it really helped them gain skills in communication and collaboration. I think particularly too, the quotes about students who have lived in this area their whole lives but have never been exposed to the marsh and the environment in this way really show why this work is so important, because there are so many young people out there who are passionate about conservation, who have ideas and enthusiasm and a strong work ethic. And I've worked with so many of those people. So I think that's why these kinds of opportunities are so important for the future. So, yeah.
Thank you, Hannah. So one of the best part about this Pepperweed project has actually been having this team of young Pepperweed technicians that is helping us get all this work done. As Hannah mentioned, it's not just about getting the work done. It turns out that I don't know why they really enjoy spending their summers pulling pepperweed in hot salt marsh with mosquitoes and like poison ivy. And as the Fish and Wildlife Service and other conservation organizations are talking about diversifying our future leaders and future employees, we've actually found this program particularly as a really great opportunity to open up and recruit beyond our normal wildlife-oriented students, which is really great. And they get a lot of great support, as Hannah alluded to, as a team, peer support as well as other mentoring. So I'll just finish up by saying that this area, this map you see is the area that we treat, and every point is a pepperweed that we have treated. So white are the ones that we were not able to treat this year. The yellow are the ones that we've eradicated. The blue are the ones that are pulled, and that is the pepperweed team out there pulling all these sites. I think last year they pulled somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000 sites in this area, and they also help in other areas as well. But as you can imagine, with this many partners and sites to treat in a 6-week window, it can be a little overwhelming. So a few years ago, we transitioned to GIS Online, the ARC collector, just to help us coordinate all this work. And two features that were really important for us. One was that we can have these layers. So this is a zoom in of, we can assign areas to specific organizations and groups so they know exactly where they need to go and treat and what was done in previous years. And then we also have, as Hannah alluded to, we do a lot of this work on private lands because we try to treat every pepperweed in the entire watershed. So we have all these permission layers that we need to keep track of. So like in this map to the right, you can see that green is we can do any kind of treatment we want. Yellow is pull only, and red is do not enter that property. So they did not give us permission. So for the good of the project long-term, it's really important that we respect those permissions. So when you have a team out there pulling, it's really important to know, for them to know where they can go and where they cannot go. And the GIS map has been really helpful in providing that information. The other thing is with, over 50 people out there treating pepperweed all at the same time, they can update these points as they treat. So we know which ones have been treated and which ones haven't, and we can follow up with them throughout the summer. So after 18 years, it is still quite a bit of work to do pepperweed, but we have seen a lot of success. Almost 30% of the sites that we have been treating previously are now clear. So this is an indication that this site is not clear yet, but you can see this is a group of middle schoolers pulling pepperweed. And the following year, there's a lot less pepperweed at this site. And the last thing we'll mention was last year with additional funding with Fish and Wildlife Service, we were able to fund Maine and New Hampshire to map pepperweed more extensively. They have a handful of sites, but were never able to comprehensively map where they were. So last year they did that. Luckily for New Hampshire, no new pepperweed was found. In Maine, one new site was found, which they were able to get on and treat right away. So. And with that, I just wanted to thank there's so many people that's involved in this project, but we could not do this project without these people in these photos. So on the right is John Terry and Sherry Molto. They are the mentors and leaders to the Climate Cafe and GOMI that Hannah mentioned. So without them, we wouldn't have the high school and college students that are so dedicated to doing the work. On the left, Liz Duff was the Mass Audubon coordinator that worked with me to get this project to where it is now. She passed away last year, unfortunately. And Lauren Healy, the student sitting on the right, actually is like Hannah, someone that started with us as a high schooler, went off to college, came back to work on the Pepperweed team, and then came back as my coordinator. And she has recently been hired as Fish and Wildlife Service employee in Oregon. So we're very excited. And that's all I have. So I don't know if we have time for questions.
If there are 2 questions in the Q&A, if you want to write the answers to those, and we'll move on to the next presenter.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much, Nancy and Hannah. That was great. It's a big project, but it sounds like you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you. Our next speaker is Heather Coste. Heather is a horticulturist who manages Breezy Island and the Four Seasons Garden at Bayard Cutting Arboretum. Before joining the ground team at the Arboretum in 2019, Heather spent a decade in the nursery trade with a focus on native plantings and sustainable horticulture. Please welcome Heather. And you can share your screen, Heather, anytime.
Okay.
Thank you.
Here we go, share screen. Make it. Is that working out?
Yes, it's not full screen though. We see your menu bar at the top, but we
let me enter full screen. There we go. Okay, folks.
Perfect.
Looks good.
Okay.
Looks good.
So I'm Heather Coste. I work at the Bayard Cutting Arboretum, and while the last talk was about this huge area and one very specific invasive, and I can't even imagine what that undertaking must be like. And it was really interesting to be able to see what you guys were working on. So that was absolutely fantastic. We're now going to talk about like this very tiny microcosm of this man-made island. So we're going to do a really brief history on the land use of Breezy Island. This has never been a wild space. So it is located on the Connetquot River. It is man-made. It has the whole history is of human use. It was actually created when the Vanderbilts dredged the river to accommodate their yacht, and the Cutting family went, hey, we'll take that dirt. And they actually created a small island out of it. It was built and planted in the 1890s, and a tea house was built for Mrs. Cutting to actually take tea on. She would walk out there every day and enjoy the space. It was originally planted with a mix of both native and non-native plants. When the property was turned over to the state in the 1950s, the tea house and the bridge had to be replaced. The tea house was just torn down and the bridge was repaired and replaced. Over the next 50 years or so, the space was taken over by the invasive species that had been planted, because a lot of these species had not been considered to be problem species in the 1890s. And we'll talk a little bit about which species those were here in a minute. It ended up being closed to the public due to a complete inability to use the space. It was not safe for anyone. And then we started a restoration project in 2016. The tea house was rebuilt based on old photographs that we had, and a native plant garden was installed in 2017. We had to do a large project for the replacement of the bulkhead to protect it and the surrounding shoreline from some erosion issues, and the area has been extended, and more planting was done started in 2019, and that project is still really ongoing. So, so the 2017 restoration, and I'm going to show you some before and after pictures here in a minute. What they did was they tried to maintain the existing healthy trees where possible. Many of the older trees did have to come down, unfortunately, but we had a number of healthy native trees already on the island, including red maple, red oak, black oak, eastern red cedar, and sassafras. And some of the species that we had to remove were extensive stands of bamboo, Phragmites reed, the various invasive honeysuckles, Iris pseudochorus, and English ivy. They had to rebuild the soil and help minimize erosion. I think it's a little bit behind the speaker view, but on this photo over here, you can see where they have put up the bannering in order to help keep the new soil in place and not washing off. And then all native species were planted into the space, and they were separated by some broad ecosystem needs. Things like an area that is a sun salt meadow now, a vernal pool that was already existing that we wanted to protect, a dry upland wood, and then the shoreline plantings. So this is a little bit of some of the before and after pictures of the 2017 restoration. All of the removals of invasives had to be done mechanically and by hand. We did not use pesticides in this area. So things were cut, they were dug out, they were removed, and then bagged and disposed of so that we wouldn't be spreading any of these around our property at the Bayard Cutting Arboretum. So all of this was done by our staff. And you can see this is the same area with the bamboo. And then a picture from 2019. This is the main walk up to the tea house, and you can see part of that vernal pool. The vernal pool is maintained on either side of that small stone bridge now. And here is part of the shoreline area. This is after the cutbacks, but this was mostly bamboo and the honeysuckle, and now we fortunately have been able to continue to control those over the last 5 years. So the 2019 expansion involved assessing the area after its initial, once things started to get settled in. So we had to look at what had worked, what had struggled, and what had failed, and if there were new problem areas. We wanted to increase the existing planting communities and species, but we also wanted to introduce new native species based on what was going on and the ecosystem services that weren't really as well presented in some cases. We wanted to expand flowering time, expand when different things set seed. We wanted to create better habitat for the animals that utilize this space. We needed to continue to remove Phragmites, and we wanted to introduce new ecosystem plantings like at the island headlands and a brackish tidal swamp area. This was mostly working on an existing palette, but we also had areas where the bamboo had come up from who knows how far beneath the soil, because the roots of that can go very far, and new stands of Phragmites, not new, but recurring stands of Phragmites that we had to deal with and start working on to actively get back under control. So here is actually one of the areas. Again, we have a before and after picture. This whole sandy area right in the front was also all Phragmites and poison ivy, which was not a fun project to be doing hand removals in, but we find that when we do hand removals and then continual cutbacks, we have a lot of luck in a lot of success in controlling the Phragmites. It's not a one-season control in that case, though it's a multi-season process, but it lets us minimize dramatically the amount of pesticides that we have to use in the area. And on the right is what this space looks like now. So we have a lot of challenges on Breezy Island. Because it is in the Connetquot and it's a tidal estuary river, we have a lot of issues with brackish water and salt water inundation, the salt spray. You can kind of see in this picture, it's hard to see, so I did put the red lines to show you where the bulkhead is, and it's about 7 feet from the edge of the bulkhead to the edge of the path, which then of course leads up, and it comes all the way up into where our staircase and pathways is. So the amount of flooding that can happen here several times a year, usually in the autumn, can be very intense. We of course need to continue to both watch for and then control all these same invasive species. Our biggest problems are probably still the Phragmites reed, which I think everyone on Long Island is going to have problems with, and the Iris pseudochorus, the invasive yellow flag iris, especially because we have our native Iris versicolor planted. When we're working with our volunteers, when we're working with our interns, it's a very big option to show the differences between the plants and how you can tell as early as possible which one's which. But sometimes we do have to wait for them to go to flower before we can for sure tell which ones we have. So of course, this is called Breezy Island. It's windy. It's very breezy. So the high winds can cause certain delicate native plants to not do very well, to struggle. The whole island has incredibly poor soil. It's mostly sand. So we've had to work a lot on rebuilding the soil structure in the different ecosystems for what is appropriate for the little mini ecosystems that have been planted in those spaces. Erosion, of course, is a huge issue. We have those varied micro ecosystems. We have sun, we have shade, there's wet, there's dry. So making sure that we're picking the right plants for these spaces becomes absolutely critical in their long-term care. We have limited irrigation access on the island, but we also have to consider things like visitor access. Because we are a public park, this isn't just a wildlife recreation area. It has to be something that our visitors can enjoy and utilize the space. But we also really want to consider the wildlife needs. We have a huge number of animals that come and utilize Breezy, possibly more animals than we have the people utilizing the space. So we want to make sure that the space is actually something that that will benefit them in addition to our human visitors. And then of course there's climate change. A lot of the severe flooding that we're seeing is something that's really increased in the last 5, 6, 7 years at the levels that we're seeing it. And we're getting warmer winters and differing rain patterns. So we want to make sure that everything that we do in this space is flexible to all of those things. So what are the goals in this space? This is a hybrid landscape. This is not a rewilding or a wilderness area, and it's not a formal garden either. But we have to keep in mind some of the aspects of public horticulture that not everyone else who is doing wilderness work needs to. So we need to balance out the access to the space for our visitors and also the appearance. Part of the best part of doing wildlife spaces is keeping it at least a little bit untidy, because that's where the animals like to be. They don't want to be in this perfectly manicured space, but we also need to make sure that it doesn't just look like a mess. Unfortunately, that is definitely something that is a concern for us there. And a big part of it is, again, that wildlife access. We want to have habitat, we want to have food, and we want to utilize minimal disturbance at the right times of year to prevent messing with the wildlife that uses the space too much. This female mallard was nesting there last year, and so we left a wide berth around her when we were doing our cutback so that she didn't have to actually feel like her nest was in any way at risk. She hatched all of her ducklings, and they ended up being able to spend most of the time on the island until they were ready to move off, and it was an absolutely delightful thing to watch for us. We also need to worry about maintenance access for the staff. We do need to be able to get our carts onto the island, so the paths have to be a certain width and accessibility. And then, of course, the resilience to changing conditions. And so what does resilience look like for Breezy Island? Again, we're talking about a man-made landscape. This is not a wild space. So everything that's happening here, we have had to build essentially from the ground up. So we want to have our balanced ecosystems with help, because we can't completely leave this space to its own devices, between both public access and also the needs to control certain invasive species while we're in here. So we are concerned about the soil ecology. We're concerned about nutrient cycling, plant interactions, so plants, how they grow together and how they interact as a layered system, plant and animal interactions. So we're talking about, yes, of course, pollinators, but even more so, do they attract the plants that help us control pest species, not the animals that control pest species, And of course, the animal-to-animal interactions. We want to look at the adaptability to change, to the change in temperatures, both hot and cold, to increased flooding, increased salt, because as we struggle with our groundwater issues on Long Island, and as the sea changes, the levels of salt are going to change one way or the other, for better or for worse. And we want to make sure that everything can handle the changes in either direction. And of course, changes in rain patterns. We also want to decrease the need for internal inputs, external inputs. We don't want to be using fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides. We don't want to be doing too much intensive weeding that we can avoid, and again, too much mulching, because we can actually kill this area with kindness if we're not careful. We don't want to create a situation where we cause so much disturbance that it becomes a not useful area for the wildlife that is utilizing the space. And here are a couple of our friends. There were the ducklings from that year. All of these shots are taken with a telephoto lens. I did not get this close to these animals. We give them as much space as we possibly can. And so how do we create resilience in this space? Because again, we're not looking at an existing space that has an existing ecosystem and seeing how we can protect it. We're building this ecosystem. So we want to know the challenges and plan for how they can be withstood. Again, we're talking about the salt spray, the flooding, the drought, high winds, and warming winters. A big part of this project has been learning the ecologies and the plant communities that inhabit similar niches naturally, and we use them for guidance. So we have used the New York Natural Heritage Program extensively, but because of climate change, we're also looking at some of the plant communities and native plants that grow slightly to the south of us. So especially wherever we can, we look at overlapping range. So we're going to look at things where we are the most northern point of their range when we're considering new plants, instead of us being the most southern point of their range. So if something is mostly going to grow in Virginia, in North Carolina, in South Carolina, and they can just handle our area, we might consider introducing it, so that as our seasons continue to get a little bit warmer, these plants are already established, and not only are we establishing the plants, but then we're also establishing corridors for the wildlife that utilizes these plants. We then, of course, create a base palette with plants that grow in the ecosystem that we're trying to mimic. So in the sun salt meadow, we're looking at things that are more shoreline prairie plants, very grass heavy, things that prefer the poor soils, things can handle sun and wind and salt spray and poor soils. And we're going to look for things that are going to fulfill a variety of niches. So we're going to look at the trees, and we're planting succession trees to take over for the trees on this island as they age out. We're looking at the shrub layer. We're looking at herbaceous materials. We're looking at ground cover. But we're also looking for, what does the plant do? What does it offer as an ecosystem service, and not to humans, but to the other plants, to the ecosystem, of course, in general, and to the animals. So we're looking for when they leaf out, when they bloom, when they seed. And we are looking for plants that are going to self-propagate as much as possible. We want things that are going to fill in the gaps as older plants die. We want a ever-shifting mosaic of these plants as the landscape continues to mature. And then on the very bottom, we've got management practices, which is just one line, because we're going to talk a bit more about that, because it's actually one of the most critical parts of what we do. Everything else is our initial setup, but it's the management practices where we really have a lot of control over creating this space and having it work the way that it's supposed to. So you can see a photo on the right. This is early winter. I think it was in December. And you can see that we don't cut back we do cut back some of the island early, but most of the island is actually left to overwinter with all of its materials in place. So we do this in order to allow things to have habitat and protection over the winter. We have overwintering bees, we have chipmunks, we have nesting birds, all sorts of animals that utilize this space until the weather gets warm again. So with our management practices, we like to minimize those chemical inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Big reasons why this is important is because we want a sustaining ecosystem. This is not a 100% closed system. It can't be, but we want to make it as close to that as possible. So we leave materials in place. We want to encourage the pest hunting insects, things that are going to take care of insects that are going to cause problems. So they just become kind of a self-correcting issue. And by having these very densely planted stands, we handle a lot of our weeding needs, with the exception of right along the edges of the paths, because there's not a lot of sun getting down to the ground to let the weed seeds even germinate. So we do minimize unwanted disturbances. We use hand tools. We don't use power tools over here. Again, if we had been using, say, hedge trimmer to try to come through and clear some of the stuff in the spring, we would have absolutely upset Miss Mallard, and she would have not necessarily come back to her eggs. So we try to keep the disturbances at a minimum by utilizing hand tools and by utilizing proper timing. We don't clear this too early. We wait until things have warmed up and things have started to emerge. And we leave much of the materials because we want to, again, you've got animals that overwinter in the leaves. You have lots of nesting birds that end up needing a little bit of space around them that's a little bit wild so that they feel safe there. And we try to utilize human disturbance to best results. So we focus on invasive removals. That is our first line of disturbance that we must do, because we do still have bamboo. We do still have Phragmites and Iris pseudochorus are probably the big three that we still have to keep an eye out, because if we don't, they take over very, very rapidly.
1 minute, Heather.
Yes. Oh, 1 minute. Oh, wow.
1
okay.
minute. Yeah.
Okay. I made this too long. I apologize.
That's
so we're
okay.
going to
That's
kind
all
of
right.
just
Better
do
too long than too short.
So we're going to do just a really quick couple things. We want to learn the plants. We want to learn them in comparison to some of the weed species that we are a little bit concerned about. We want to learn them at all stages of their life cycle. We want to feed the soil. So we're going to leave leaves. We're going to mulch in the woodland areas, but not in the prairie areas. We use a combination of wood chips and compost. You're looking at nitrogen fixing. You're looking at ephemerals, deep roots, and fibrous roots. You want to learn your invertebrates. You want to know what insects are doing what, who's eating who, and what part they play in the ecosystem. And of course, we really want to vary the plant types. So you're going to want ferns and grasses, things that you're not thinking of normally because you're thinking about, oh, let's feed the pollinators, but we need to feed the entire ecosystem and all of the animals that come with it. And they all need more than just flowers for pollinators. And we do very much let the volunteers do the work. These are all native plants that have come in since we've been controlling for the invasives. By controlling for the invasives, we leave room for stuff that can come in on its own. And there's my last slide. So I didn't have too much. So this is, like I said, this is a reclaimed landscape. This is not it's not a rewilding project. We are managing it in a slightly different way than you're going to see for some of those. And there we go.
Thank you, Heather. That's a great project. I'd love to come out there and see it sometime.
I would love to have you.
With the whole Lisma staff, perhaps. Looks like a beautiful
place. We would be
delighted.
Absolutely delighted to host you guys for a day. So if you want to reach out, we can arrange something.
All right, we're gonna. Thank you.
Great work, Heather.
All right, our next speaker is Anthony Marinello. Anthony spent his childhood summers upstate, exploring the backwoods and creeks of the Hudson Valley. It is there that Anthony developed an appreciation of nature and yearned to bring a bit of wilderness or wildness back to suburbia. In 2017, Anthony founded Drop Seed Native Landscapes to provide Long Islanders with the guidance and ability to transform their island into a native plant oasis to sustain both humans and wildlife alike. Anthony was recently featured in Newsday and the Long Island Herald for his work as a native plant gardener, as well as his work educating the public on the ecological benefits of native plants. Please welcome Anthony.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, everyone who has come together to plan and organize this event for us. I'm going to share my screen now and get started. So, as Bill mentioned, I am the owner of Drop Seed Native Landscapes. I have a small retail native plant nursery, and I also offer consultations to help homeowners figure out exactly what plants they are growing in their property. Are you guys seeing the right screen?
Yes, I think so. Oh, no, can you,
got-
we
you got
can
a
see
full
your
screen,
menu
right?
bar still at the top. So if you can set it to full screen,
All right, let me see what's going on.
we can see the slides, but it could be bigger.
Okay, so it's just not
It's not full screen.
full screen. Let me see. You know what? I'll do it the old way then. Give me 2 seconds. I'm gonna set this up. All right. So what I do is I often go to people's homes, and there are questions about what they are growing on their own property and what is invasive and what is native to where they are. And that's where I come in and I help people figure out what they should be growing on their property. And I will do this right now, share my screen with everyone, the proper screen. Are you seeing the slide now?
I think, yes, that's
All
it,
good.
Anthony.
All good.
Thank you.
I'm seeing like an image of myself. That's why I want to make sure you guys are seeing the right thing. Okay, so today we'll be speaking about the proliferation of invasive species in the home landscape. So the issue with invasive species, if you have not caught on yet, is that they're not native to the region that they've been introduced in. And what happens is they proliferate away from human habitation and human cultivation, and they outcompete and displace our native plants, which then disrupts the local ecosystem. So just for some numbers, this has recently made the rounds on social media and has gotten a lot of attention. There are 400,000 species of plants on the planet, just about. 18,000 of those species were native to North America before Europeans set foot on the continent. 30,000 new plant species have been introduced into North America in the past 400 years. So that's about 75 new species every single year being introduced from other continents over the past 400 years. Of those 30,000 introduced species, about 5,000 have escaped cultivation. And that's only the ones we know about and have documented. There's most likely a lot more that are either going unnoticed or are actually, we just don't have the data yet to actually classify them as invasive species. And of course, there's always new species coming in on a daily basis that always have the potential to become invasive. So of those 5,000 escapees, only 500 that we know of have become documented to be invasive, but that's still a large amount of plants. And you can just see, you know, we introduced more plant species onto this continent than had existed naturally. So that's really just throwing off the ecosystem completely, whether it's in a natural area or it's also, you know, in a human-centric development or community, city or suburban area. Movement of life like this has never occurred at this magnitude before in Earth's history. Evolution does not happen this quickly. Plants especially do not move around this quickly. Animals, you know, certain animals, fine, especially if you have wings, birds especially move around quite often, but plants do not have the mechanisms to transport themselves across oceans and across continents like we have now enabled them to do. So the whole reason this is an issue, of course, is because the native plants are that foundation of the food web. The insects that are local to the area have evolved with their respective host plants in the environment, and that makes these plants resilient through evolution from pests, from deer and rabbit browsing. You don't need any fertilizer because they have evolved to handle the low nutrient soils that we have on Long Island, and they don't need any supplemental irrigation if you planted the right plant in the right place. And that also lowers the long-term maintenance costs for homeowners who are looking to save some money in property maintenance. Another big outcome of using native plants is that because they are pest resistant and because they don't need fertilizer, you will be actually applying less pesticides or no pesticides at all, which is great for pollution and great for helping our insects and other pollinators. And also, because native plants originated in this ecoregion, we don't need to go around into our local natural areas and clean up after them like we do with invasive species. So many times invasive species, once they start to colonize a natural area, the DEC, the townships, or some other organization usually has to come in and then clean it up using some sort of either manual labor or many times herbicides. So by choosing to use native plants in our community centers, our towns, our villages, and our homes and our businesses, we are actually preventing the use of pesticides that are not needed, and we are limiting the use of herbicides that will no longer be needed to remediate the invasive species issue as they colonize our natural areas. We'll be preventing that colonization altogether. So here's a nice chart that Doug Tallamy has put together through his studies. Many of these species used to be planted up until recently, but now a lot of flashy cultivated varieties and exotic species have flooded the market. You know, the grass is always greener on the other side, so people tend to want the exotic foliage, even tropical foliage in the summer now. I see a lot of people planting palm trees for a season. But it's just important to understand that those exotic plants that don't have an origin in North America or in our region in the Northeast are not doing anything to support the local ecology. So if you look here at this chart, the top 3 producers are oak, cherries, and willows. So willow can host over 380 different species of caterpillars. So whether it's a moth or a butterfly, you will be hosting hundreds and hundreds of different species of caterpillars. While if you look at Kentucky coffee tree, which is native to North America, but it's native down south, it only hosts 3 different species of caterpillar in the Northeast region. So it really helps to look at a chart like this, look at the data that's provided, and see what you can do to increase your productivity ecologically on your own property. And these native plants are really the top producers, especially on the left side, oaks in particular, that will be doing the bulk of the work in producing these soft-bodied insects that will then in turn go on to feed the songbirds that feed their chicks a diet exclusively of caterpillars and other soft-bodied insects. So without these native species, we don't have a food chain. And what happens is when you have a plant like Bradford pear starting to invade the Pine Barren region, or even let's say Hempstead Lake State Park, which is where I frequent very often, you have now less space being occupied by our native oak trees and more space being occupied by a foreign pear species. And now you're not having the same productivity occurring in that location. So this is how these native species, these invasive species negatively affect our local ecology. As you can see here in this photo, this is winged euonymus. Winged euonymus is used extensively in the landscape industry and has been for quite a few decades now. New York State actually had prohibited this species for quite a bit, and then they started introducing some sterile varieties. Unfortunately, many homeowners wouldn't know the difference between a sterile variety or the typical variety that is invasive. So it becomes a little tricky for a homeowner to make that decision if they have one on their property. But as you can see, these plants in particular really spread out quite effectively. And this is because songbirds are the ones that really come in, they eat the fruit, which is a small red berry, and then they disperse the fruit in their droppings throughout their migration and throughout their movements through the local area. So this is an image of an eastern woodland in eastern North America. And what you're seeing here is in fall, the foliage of winged euonymus. And it is just a monoculture of winged euonymus. So this plant, while yes, it may be feeding songbirds during the fall migration with the red berries, is not productive any other time of the year. So it's not providing songbird with caterpillars to feed their chicks, and it's really just not being productive as much as these native plants would be, and it's disrupting the ecosystem in that manner. So that has been severing the food chain at its source. This plant in particular tends to be used a lot on my clients' properties when I go out into Suffolk County. They do get pretty large and they're easily shaped. So a lot of people use them both as a privacy screening and also just because the fall foliage is quite ornamental. So those characteristics do make it a good garden plant to use, but we do have plenty of native alternatives to use instead, which we will discuss later on. So now this is how a woodland should look on Long Island. So this is a view of a typical coastal oak laurel forest. This image was provided by Greg Ettinger with the New York Natural Heritage Program. Now, this is mostly an understory of mountain laurel, lowbush blueberry, and huckleberry. These are all heath species, and they are very common to be found in the oak woodlands within Long Island, both in Nassau County and parts of Suffolk County. So this is what you should see in a natural ecosystem on Long Island. Blueberries in particular are another high insect hosting plant. They host, I believe, over 60 different species of caterpillar, if I'm not mistaken. And then, of course, the huckleberries and the blueberries together are feeding a bunch of different forms of wildlife, from turtles to songbirds to mammals, with the berries as well. So these species are actually, all three of these species are decently commonly available in the nursery trade, but for some reason they just really aren't used quite extensively. And if they were, we would have blueberries being dispersed by songbirds and huckleberries instead of winged euonymus. So English ivy is another one. Particularly, I've noticed this a lot in Nassau County. The more east you go, you tend to see a little less of it, but a lot of it in Nassau County, especially the North Shore areas. Again, English ivy does have that cultural significance, especially, when you consider Ivy League schools. This is the ivy that's in that description there. English ivy, there is also for some reason, there is still a debate on whether or not you should consider it invasive. I know some areas up in New England, they claim that it's so cold there that the plant doesn't actually ever reproduce. On Long Island, we know that is not the case. I'm on a mission to try to get as many people to get rid of their English ivy as possible and hopefully get this plant listed on the prohibited list for New York State. Anywhere you look in any town in Nassau County, on any road in Nassau County, in any neighborhood in Nassau County, you will see English ivy growing up a tree and smothering our native trees. They have invaded almost every woodland, every park, every natural area, any roadside. So, even Sunrise Highway, Southern State Parkway, the Northern State Parkway, you will see this plant just growing and growing and growing and smothering and just going about its business. Many people still do plant it as well. So they will also use it because it does have such high shade tolerance and it is evergreen. They like to use it as a nice ground cover in their woodland gardens. I've had people say, I need this plant because otherwise I won't have anything else there and it won't be green the rest, for the full year. There's plenty of native species you can use. If you want something that grows vertically, like another vine, there's plenty of native vines you can use, like trumpet honeysuckle, that also has the benefit of then having flowers and berries to help attract hummingbirds and feed songbirds. And then there's also ground covers like winterberry or golden groundsel that are evergreen or semi-evergreen and will also provide you with extra ornamentation through ornamental red berries or a good spring bloom, such as the case with the golden groundsel. Oh, and also I do just want to mention that English ivy has actually been prohibited in many states across the country already, particularly in the northwest area of the country. These bans have been in place for almost 20 years now, and unfortunately in the east we're just a little slow to react. So some commonly used invasive species in the home landscape again would be English ivy, Callery or Bradford pear. These are really planted quite extensively up until recently, even by villages and towns as a street tree. These trees, at least in my neighborhood now, are actually finally getting a disease. What looks like cedar apple rust is actually effectively killing them. A lot of them are not coming back this year on my own block, which I'm happy to see. Unfortunately, most homeowners don't see the signs that their tree is dead, and they have yet to remove them. So that becomes a dangerous issue too, because the tree could either fall on a car or a person and injure them. Japanese holly is another one that is increasingly becoming invasive in our pine barrens out east. False holly also in the Hamptons has been documented as being invasive. English holly has been documented within the New Jersey pine barrens, so it's only a matter of time before it starts popping up within our own pine barrens. Burning bush, again, is a very large contributor to our ecosystem decline, as well as things like winter creeper, barberry, and rugosa rose and privet. So privet, again, especially out east in the Hamptons regions where you're not allowed to have fences. So what people do is they plant these beautiful hedges unfortunately, the hedges are made of privet. Another benefit that people seek the privet out for is because deer don't tend to eat it. So instead, I would recommend a bayberry hedge, where the deer will avoid the bayberry. You'll still get a mostly evergreen hedge out of it, and you will be supporting songbirds and pollinators as well. Rugosa rose.
Anthony, you have
yeah.
about a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll keep going. So we'll skip what's native to my area, and we will just do plant this and not that. So English ivy, plant golden groundsel instead. As you can see, beautiful foliage and great yellow flowers. Instead of boxwood or Japanese holly, plant inkberry holly. You wouldn't know the difference if you looked at one or the other, and you save because you do not have to shake these at all. They tend to grow perfectly as orbs, especially the cultivated varieties. Burning bush, don't plant burning bush. Instead, plant black chokeberry or high bush blueberry. They have similar, really nice fall foliage, and you get an added benefit of having flowers and fruit that you can eat. Butterfly bush, don't plant butterfly bush. Instead, plant things like New Jersey tea or Clethra alnifolia, which is summer sweet or sweet coastal pepper bush. You'll have plenty of butterflies on those plants and plenty of pollinators as well, and it has the same bloom period and similar flowers, and it's highly ornamental. And then instead of barberry or Japanese maple, which people seek out for the purple or red foliage, I recommend 9-bark because it has, many of the cultivars do have that red or purple foliage. It has beautiful white flowers cascading over the entire plant, and it will help support pollinators and other insects and wildlife within your garden. And then instead of Cali or Bradford pear, plant serviceberry. So there's many different species of serviceberry. There's 2 that you can grow as a tree or a shrub option. You can see how beautiful the flowers are in the springtime. It's a great option to choose instead of Cali pear. Not invasive, supports pollinators, songbirds, and also has edible fruit for humans if you're interested in eating some of the fruit. Here's a gray catbird, hunted caterpillars, and a wild black cherry, just to show you the importance of planting native plants and how this songbird is probably going to go and feed that to its chick. I just want to say a special thank you to everyone who put this together again. Liz and the staff, you guys are great. And there's a Facebook group you can sign up for if you guys are interested. Long Island Native Plant Gardening Group on Facebook. We'd be happy to have you.
Thank you, Anthony. Very informative.
Thank you.
The English ivy is a tragedy.
Anybody
that walks around any wooded neighborhood can see big, beautiful oak trees being killed by English ivy.
Yes, it's a ticking time bomb, in my opinion. We have yet to really give that the attention it deserves.
I agree. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes. We have until 10:30, so we have 6 minutes for some questions and answers. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of everyone's screen, and the presenters, there's an option to either answer live or type answer. I don't know how that would work. So try either one, answer live or type an answer. Some of them have been answered already, so there might not be that many left.
I'm going to answer Amanda's question on nativars. So it helps to just know, I had to skip over that part in my presentation, but it helps to just know how your cultivar is produced. So if it's a clone variety, if it's a hybrid variety, if the variety has a change to the flower shape or the fruit structure, you want to avoid that. But my opinion is not all cultivars are created equal. Some are to be avoided, like the hybrids are to be avoided. Anything with a larger showy bloom, double petaled flowers, I avoid those cultivars. But other cultivars, like let's say hello yellow butterfly weed, which is just a naturally occurring yellow phase of butterfly weed, which is also open pollinated and breeds true to itself from seed. I have no problem using something like that as like a nice accent in a home garden.
And Nancy and Heather, if you see any questions there too, and Hannah, feel free to jump in. I think they might be answered pretty much.
Yeah, a lot of them are answered already. Yeah. I do see one question from Rob asking about the survey didn't pop up on his last session. So I'm not sure about that. I'll send that question over to Abby. for you.
I posted the link a couple of times. I'll post it once more.
Okay.
But yeah, it didn't pop up like it did in the last session. I'm not sure how that works or doesn't work.
I have a question for Nancy and Hannah. As for the all those red circles of people that wouldn't agree to have you pull or cut pepperweed, seems like a lot of people won't allow it. Any thoughts on that? Because we have here on Long Island at West Meadow Beach, we have private landowners that have pepperweed also. Or any pointers, tips?
I'm not sure she's still in the room.
Yeah.
So I'm not involved with
All
that, but I kind of run into similar issues with homeowners. Like, so I was working with some homeowners who actually have like a artificial dune system created on their gated community, and they don't, sometimes it's like one of these situations where it's like they don't care if the plant's invasive if you're changing their view of what they have. So, you know, I was trying to educate them on what's going to be best to preserve the dune and prevent them from being flooded next storm event. And they were less concerned about that than me changing the view that they're used to right now. You know, so as soon as like you started speaking about maybe putting in some service berries or putting in some bayberries to help hold the dune together, their first question was, are you changing my view of the water? You know, that's what they're concerned about. And unfortunately, there's still this disconnect between the ecological problem that's at stake with including an invasive, rather than, you know, you might have to sacrifice the same view that you're used to, or just, you know, go through a temporary change for a short while. And some people, they just still have that disconnect, and there's still that that central focus too of, you know, like, this is mine and I don't want you in it, I don't want you changing it. And there's always that too, where it's hard to completely convince certain people of certain things, even when you're presenting them with the facts. Like multiflora rose, I tell people all the time, you know, multiflora rose really is one of like the worst plants we have on Long Island. Many understories of our woodlands are just choked with multiflora rose. But then I go to people's homes and they have a giant vine of it growing in their backyard. And no matter what I do to try to explain to them that it's really not a good plant to have, all they know is, well, I see the birds come and eat the berries all winter long, so I'm attracting the birds and supporting the birds, so it must be good. So that might be something to do with it too, where maybe, you know, they just enjoy the view that they have, or they see wildlife utilizing it and they're just not understanding the full picture.
Yeah, good comment. I've noticed that in my invasive species work, if you can assure people that you're improving their view by controlling invasive plants, they like that. Or if you're helping combat erosion, they like that too. People are motivated by self-interest, I guess, at sometimes.
You would think, but like I said, those people that I was speaking about, they didn't care that I was trying to help prevent like their whole home from flooding in a hurricane, as long as, you know, their view of the Long Island Sound wasn't affected by it. You know, it was very strange. It was a little bit of a roadblock for me with that organization and that group of people.
Yeah.